Rajiv Mehra promised wealth, success, and a future nobody could resist. But within days his charm turned into chaos, and what seemed like an opportunity became a nightmare that destroyed hundreds of lives overnight. Rajiv Mehra arrived in Mumbai like a man destined for success. At just 27, he had a confident air, the kind that made people instantly believe he was someone important. His clothes were sharp, his shoes polished, and his watch always seemed to catch the light at just the right angle. He moved through the city with purpose, attending networking events, sitting in trendy cafes, and shaking hands with investors who were eager to find the next big opportunity. To anyone watching, Rajiv seemed unstoppable, a young man building an empire from sheer talent and determination. He claimed to have founded a tech startup that was on the verge of changing the way India used financial apps. The name of the company appeared in local business magazines, alongside glowing headlines that painted him as a visionary entrepreneur. Social media profiles added to the illusion, images of Rajiv standing beside luxury cars, inside opulent offices with glass walls, and attending high-profile parties with people who looked successful. The city seemed to watch him with admiration, convinced that he had unlocked the secret to wealth and innovation. Investors began approaching him in droves. Small business owners, middle-class families, and young professionals all saw Rajiv as a golden opportunity. He promised them fast profits, often claiming that his app was about to explode in the market, that early investors would soon see returns far beyond their imagination. Some handed over thousands of rupees, others hundreds of thousands. No matter the amount, Rajiv treated every investor with the same charm, making each one feel like an exclusive part of his growing empire. Rajiv was careful in the way he presented himself. His office was sleek, with modern furniture, and a receptionist who always smiled. Visitors were impressed by the atmosphere of success, by the visible signs that the business was thriving. Every corner of the office seemed designed to inspire confidence, from the certificates on the wall to the computers displaying graphs of imaginary growth. Even casual conversations were laced with statistics and projections, all carefully chosen to sound realistic. Those who left his office were often so convinced of his legitimacy that they would immediately call friends or family, urging them to invest as well. Yet behind the perfectly curated images and carefully rehearsed presentations, there was a different reality. Rajiv's startup was not profitable, and the technology he claimed to have developed was far from functional. Every success story he shared, every chart showing exponential growth, was fabricated. He had mastered the art of illusion, making his business appear credible to anyone who glanced at it superficially. People were blinded by appearances, and Rajiv thrived in that blindness. Despite the impressive facade, there were small cracks that only a few noticed. Some investors grew suspicious when promised returns were slightly delayed, or when explanations for setbacks seemed vague. A few questioned the authenticity of certain documents, but Rajiv was always ready with a smooth answer, a convincing smile, and more charts to reassure them. Doubts were easily dismissed, replaced by the allure of joining what seemed to be an unstoppable financial journey. Rajiv's rise was rapid and intoxicating, creating a sense of urgency among investors who feared missing out. They were drawn not only to the promise of wealth, but to the charisma of the man himself. In the city's crowded market of opportunities, he had managed to stand out, combining charm, sophistication, and the illusion of legitimacy. To the outside world, Rajiv Mehra was a success story in the making. A young entrepreneur who seemed to have all the answers. People trusted him, invested in him, and began imagining a future of prosperity built on his promises. But beneath the surface, a dangerous game had already begun, and the first steps of a web of deception were being carefully laid, one investor at a time. As Rajiv Mehra's reputation grew, so did the number of people willing to invest in his so-called tech startup. Each new investor brought in more money, and each transaction seemed to confirm that his business was thriving. But the truth was far from what anyone imagined. Rajiv had created an intricate system designed to make his company appear successful while hiding the fact that no real profits were being generated. He was running a classic Ponzi scheme, using the money from new investors to pay off earlier ones, creating a cycle of illusion that seemed unstoppable. Rajiv was meticulous in his planning. He knew that a single misstep could ruin everything he had built. He maintained detailed spreadsheets, forged documents, and carefully crafted bank statements. Every report he shared with investors was designed to look legitimate, complete with graphs showing steady growth and charts suggesting expansion into new markets. Even some of the city's financial advisors, when casually reviewing his numbers, were impressed. They could not imagine the scale of deception that was hidden beneath the surface. To make the scheme even more convincing, Rajiv staged small successes. Occasionally, he would make a symbolic payout, a few investors, claiming that the profits from his apps or investments had finally come through. These payouts were never from real earnings. They were the money from newer investors. But seeing tangible returns, even small ones, strengthened the trust of everyone involved. Families continued to invest, thinking they were part of a legitimate business opportunity, while the illusion of growth grew stronger with each passing day. Rajiv also expanded his influence beyond the immediate circle of investors. He built relationships with journalists, community leaders, and small-scale politicians, creating an image of someone who was both credible and well-connected. Media articles painted him as an innovator in the tech sector, praising his vision and the speed at which his company was growing. For many, this seemed like proof that he was trustworthy. Even friends and distant acquaintances who had never met him in person felt inspired to invest. The web of deception was spreading wider than anyone could have anticipated. Despite this carefully maintained facade, subtle cracks began to appear. Some investors noticed that withdrawals were sometimes delayed, or that explanations for setbacks were vague and inconsistent. A few had conversations with financial advisors who questioned the source of the supposed profits. But Rajiv was always ready. He could explain away doubts with confidence, using technical jargon, carefully worded reports, and promises of imminent breakthroughs. He understood human psychology better than most, knowing exactly how to manipulate hope and fear to his advantage. As the months passed, the scale of his operations became more complex. Rajiv was juggling dozens of investors, multiple bank accounts, and a growing stack of fabricated documents. The pressure was immense, but he thrived on it. He believed he was untouchable, convinced that the carefully constructed illusion would hold indefinitely. Yet beneath the surface, the tension was building. Every lie, every fabricated transaction, every manipulated statement added another layer of risk. One mistake could unravel everything. The turning point came quietly, almost imperceptibly. A small group of investors, growing impatient with delays and irregularities, began to ask more probing questions. They sought evidence, not just promises. Rajiv's smooth answers could no longer mask the reality for long. The first real doubts began to surface, seeding anxiety among those who had once trusted him with that question. It was a sign that the carefully maintained house of cards was starting to tremble. By now Rajiv's web of deception had grown so intricate that even he struggled to keep track of it all. What had begun as an ambitious scheme to impress investors had become a precarious balancing act, where one misstep could destroy years of carefully constructed lies. And unbeknownst to everyone around him, the first cracks were only the beginning of a collapse that would soon spiral far beyond anyone's imagination. The first cracks in Rajiv Mehra's carefully constructed world began to show in ways no one could ignore. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, with delays in payments to some investors. What had once been small, easily explained issues now began to multiply. A few families who had invested significant sums noticed that the promised profits were taking longer than expected to appear in their accounts. Rajiv continued to reassure them with emails full of technical jargon and carefully worded excuses, blaming minor market fluctuations and unexpected delays in app launches. For a time people believed him, trusting that these hiccups were temporary and that the returns would soon arrive. But as the weeks turned into months, anxiety among investors grew. Whispers began circulating in private groups and online forums. A few outspoken investors voiced their concerns publicly, questioning the authenticity of Rajiv's financial statements. Suddenly, the illusion of prosperity he had so meticulously maintained began to feel fragile. What once seemed like an unstoppable rise now seemed questionable, and people who had been eager to invest were hesitant to hand over more money. It was during this fragile period that a small investigative blog decided to dig deeper into Rajiv's company. The author, a financial journalist with a reputation for exposing scams, started analyzing public records, cross-checking claims about the company's revenue, and examining its corporate filings. What the investigation revealed was alarming. Some of the supposed revenue streams were entirely fictitious. Contracts with supposed business partners did not exist, and many of the names listed as clients were unverifiable. It was not just that the profits were smaller than claimed, it appeared that much of the company's operations were based entirely on deception. The blog post, though small at first, spread quickly across social media. Investors who had been unsure now felt validated in their doubts. Panic began to ripple quietly at first, then more visibly. Calls to Rajiv increased, emails flooded his inbox, and questions that could not be answered started piling up. For the first time, the carefully maintained confidence that had defined his image began to waver. Rajiv responded with the same charm and smooth reassurances, but the cracks in his narrative were growing too large to conceal. Then came the most shocking ripple quietly at first, then more visibly. Calls to Rajiv increased, emails flooded his inbox, and questions that could not be answered started piling up. For the first time, the carefully maintained confidence that had defined his image began to waver. Rajiv responded with the same charm and smooth reassurances, but the cracks in his narrative were growing too large to conceal. Then came the most shocking turn of all. Rajiv disappeared. Overnight, his office was abandoned, computers left on, and personal items left behind as if he had vanished into thin air. His phone went unanswered. His social media accounts were suddenly deactivated, and no one could locate him. Investors were thrown into panic. Some feared that he had fled with all their money, while others wondered if something far worse had occurred. The sudden disappearance magnified the fear that had been building quietly over the previous months. Authorities were slow to respond at first. The case seemed complicated, with thousands of investors and millions of rupees involved. Investigators had to piece together a trail of bank transfers, forged documents, and falsified records. Meanwhile, the families who had trusted Rajiv were left in limbo, unsure whether they would ever recover their life savings. Many faced financial crises, and the emotional toll was immense. Even as the investigation began, more strange details emerged. Some employees claimed that certain accounts had been manipulated so skillfully that even they had not realized the irregularities at the time. Others reported that Rajiv had taken extreme measures to ensure no one outside his closest circle could trace the money. The deeper authorities looked, the more complex and sinister the scheme appeared. It became clear that Rajiv Mehra's disappearance was not just a temporary setback for investors. It was the moment when a carefully hidden fraud began to unravel completely. What had started as delayed payments and minor doubts had escalated into a full-blown crisis. The man who once seemed untouchable had vanished, leaving behind a web of deception, confusion, and fear. Overnight, the dream of easy wealth had turned into a nightmare, and the dark turn of this fraud story was only beginning. As authorities began digging into Rajiv Mehra's operations, the scale of his deception became horrifyingly clear. The initial reports of delayed payments and falsified documents were only the tip of the iceberg. Investigators discovered that millions of rupees had been siphoned into offshore accounts, hidden behind layers of shell companies and fake identities. Every transaction, every bank statement, and every contract that Rajiv had shown to investors was carefully manipulated. The deeper they looked, the more they realized the fraud was not just a local scheme, it had national and international implications. Families who had invested their life savings were devastated. Some had put in money they had saved for years, hoping to secure their children's education or a future home. Others had borrowed against property or taken loans, trusting that Rajiv's promises of fast profits would turn their lives around. Now those dreams had vanished overnight, replaced by uncertainty, fear and anger. The emotional toll on these ordinary people was immense. Many felt betrayed not only by Rajiv but by the entire system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. The investigation uncovered another layer of darkness. Rajiv had stolen the identities of multiple people, creating fake investor profiles to make his operation appear larger and more legitimate. Some of the people whose identities were used had no idea they were involved, and in some cases, this led to unexpected legal troubles. Authorities realized that the scam had affected not just money but the personal lives of hundreds, creating ripple effects far beyond the immediate circle of investors. Every new piece of evidence seemed to reveal a more elaborate scheme than previously imagined. Rajiv had even set up dummy offices and fake phone lines to make it seem as though his company was operating in multiple cities. Employees were sometimes kept in the dark, believing they were working for a legitimate startup while unknowingly supporting the larger fraud. The meticulous planning and the ability to manipulate trust were astounding, making it clear that this was not just a reckless gamble but a carefully orchestrated criminal operation. Public reaction was intense. News of the scam spread across media outlets, sparking debates about oversight, regulation and the vulnerability of ordinary investors to elaborate financial frauds. Social media exploded with outrage, as victims shared their stories and warned others not to fall prey to similar schemes. The case became a symbol of how charm, confidence and a convincing facade could be used to exploit trust on a massive scale. Despite the growing evidence, questions remained about how Rajiv had been able to evade detection for so long. Some suggested that he had contacts in the financial sector who had helped him cover his tracks. Others speculated that authorities had been slow to act because the fraud involved many small transactions that individually seemed legitimate. Whatever the reason, the truth was undeniable. A man who appeared so successful and trustworthy had destroyed the lives of hundreds with calculated precision. As investigators pieced together the full scope of the scam, it became evident that Rajiv's disappearance had been strategic. He had vanished at the exact moment when scrutiny was increasing, leaving behind chaos and confusion. Every lead seemed to circle back to him, yet his whereabouts remained a mystery. The very success of his scheme had been built on creating illusions so convincing that even those closest to him had been fooled until the very end. The dark reality was now unavoidable. What had begun as a promising investment opportunity had turned into a nightmare. Rajiv Mehra was not just a fraudster. He was a master manipulator who had used his intelligence, charm, and careful planning to devastate lives. And yet, even with all the evidence and public outrage, one question remained unanswered. Where was Rajiv, and what was he planning next? The case was far from over, and the story was about to take an even more shocking turn. Just when it seemed that Rajiv Mehra had disappeared without a trace, a breakthrough came that no one had anticipated. Months after his sudden vanishing, a tip from a local informant led authorities to a remote town in Rajasthan. There, in a quiet neighborhood far removed from the hustle and chaos of Mumbai, Rajiv was living under a new identity. He had adopted a completely different lifestyle, blending into the small community, taking on a modest job and avoiding any attention. It was a stark contrast to the flamboyant life he had once led, but his disappearance had been calculated. He knew that the longer he stayed hidden, the less likely authorities would be able to trace him. The arrest was carried out quietly, almost like a shadow operation. Authorities did not want a public spectacle that could alarm the investors or incite panic. When they finally confronted him, Rajiv's calm demeanor was almost chilling. He appeared collected, as though he had anticipated this moment all along. But the investigation had only just begun. While Rajiv was in custody, authorities had to unravel the final layers of his elaborate scheme, and what they discovered shocked even seasoned investigators. The first revelation was the existence of an accomplice within the financial regulatory system. This insider had provided Rajiv with crucial information, helping him manipulate accounts and avoid detection for years. It was a betrayal that went beyond the ordinary scope of fraud. It revealed a network of corruption that had enabled Rajiv to operate on such a large scale. The accomplice had benefited financially, but had also lent legitimacy to Rajiv's operation, making it nearly impossible for ordinary investigators to see the truth. This partnership was the missing link that explained how a single man could deceive hundreds of investors for so long. Further examination revealed that Rajiv had been extremely meticulous in covering his tracks. Many of the offshore accounts were in jurisdictions with weak financial oversight, and some of the money had been laundered through multiple small transactions, making it nearly invisible to standard audits. Yet the investigators persisted, tracing the funds step by step, uncovering the scale of the loss. Millions of rupees that had disappeared overnight from the lives of unsuspecting families, middle-class professionals, and small business owners. The trial that followed was widely covered in national media. Rajiv's calm, calculated demeanor during court proceedings only intensified public fascination. He had manipulated trust, played on greed, and created an illusion so convincing that entire communities had fallen under it. The courtroom revelations of forged documents, fabricated clients, and stolen identities left everyone in shock. Even the accomplice, when confronted, could not deny the evidence, exposing the depth of the conspiracy. Ultimately, Rajiv was sentenced to life in prison, and his accomplice received a lengthy term as well. Compensation for victims was arranged through a combination of seized assets and frozen accounts, but the damage extended beyond money. Many families had been left emotionally scarred, their faith in financial systems and people shattered. The case became a national cautionary tale, a vivid example of how charm, intelligence, and meticulous planning could be weaponized to exploit trust. The story of Rajiv Mehra serves as a reminder that not everything that glitters is gold. What began as a promising investment opportunity turned into a nightmare for hundreds of people, all because they were drawn in by appearances and promises. The dark turn of this fraud, which started quietly and escalated overnight, highlighted the importance of vigilance, skepticism, and the need to question even the most convincing of claims. Even now, years after the trial, the story is remembered not just for the crime, but for the intricate ways one man had manipulated an entire network of trust, proving that deception can thrive where people least expect it. The nightmare that began with a simple promise of wealth ended with justice, but the lessons remain unforgettable, a warning to anyone who might one day be seduced by the allure of fast fortune.